Hey, why don't we start? It's a real pleasure to have the second of the seminar on politics and security. Today we have someone who is well known to everyone, Volodymyr Dubovyk, who's a professor of international relations at Odessa's Meshchikov University. He's taught in a large share of North American universities, including the University of Washington, Austin. And I think you were also, are you now in Wisconsin?
I was a guest talk, but I'm at Tufts.
Oh, you're at Tufts. Okay. And he's a well-known expert in regional and international security and Ukrainian foreign policy. So I believe you're going to talk today about sort of, basically how to preserve
Yes.
Ukraine's security. So why don't you go forth and hopefully we'll have a lively discussion.
All right. Thank you, Lucan. Thank you, Olga. Thank you, Arba. Thank you, everyone who is involved in putting together this conversation today, and in general for putting together this project. Really been a pleasure dealing with you. You've been very efficient, very helpful. So thank you so much. But in terms of our conversation today, I don't know if I'm really that well known to everyone here, but now because of this project that we have, maybe I'm better known to some people, and maybe some of you whom I didn't have a pleasure to know before this project, I would know more about you. So with some of you, I'm already friends with on Facebook. That's already something, follow what you're doing. You may have a chance of following what I'm doing. But in general, Lucan skipped a long introduction. That's a good thing. But just to reiterate, I am associate professor and docent from Odessa Mechnikov National University at the Department of International Relations. But currently, yes, I'm also a visiting professor, scholar at risk, as they call it here, at Tufts University, which is technically in the little town of Medford, Massachusetts, but basically in the greater Boston area. So I've been teaching here. Last semester, I taught a course on security of the Black Sea region. This semester, I'm teaching a course which is ambitiously and broadly called Ukraine's Security and Foreign Policy. And also, as Lucan has mentioned, I'm also doing some outreach. I'm trying to do things outside of Boston. Like a week before yesterday, I was indeed in Madison, University of Wisconsin, Madison, with some talks. Last week, I was University of West Virginia and University of Pittsburgh with talks. And tomorrow, I'm doing my class here in Boston. On Mondays, I have a long 3 hours class. On Mondays here in Boston at Tufts. And tomorrow I go to Washington, D.C., where I'm going to have 7 talks in 3.5 days. So the idea is to have an outreach to as many audiences as you can. Since I'm here, I'm lucky one, I suppose, because I can reach directly in person to audiences here and remind them that the war is very much ongoing and we still need support and we still need assistance from the U.S. as ever before. There are hard months, maybe years ahead. Nothing easy is ahead. So therefore, for U.S. to stay involved and others like Canada, like other countries in the pro-Ukraine coalition of countries, it's very important to remind them that the war, even though it's almost a year old now, well, 11.5 months, so to speak, it's still very much raging, very active, very kinetic. Things can change. It's not a trench warfare yet. It's not some kind of stalemate yet. It could go both ways. I mean, of course, it's clear to us now that Russia could not achieve the victory they've been planning for initially in this war, but they can still achieve some tactical gains here and there. And that's very important for us to deny them the chance. And that's why support here in Western in North America, so to speak, is very important. But today, indeed, I want to talk more, not just about this war, which is ongoing, but basically more about what's going to happen when this war is somehow over. And this is a problem in itself, because we don't know how this war will end. I mean, we all have our hopes, our optimism, our grit, our resilience. We kind of know what might not happen, most probably, but we don't know exact details, the outlines of what's going to happen at the end of the war. We don't know. I mean, and what kind of resolution there will be? Would there actually be some kind of agreement, or would there be no agreement at all, or just de facto ceasefire or something, or armistice? We don't know. When would that happen? What would be happening with Ukraine in many senses, politically, socially, economically, militarily, because we have army which is growing stronger, which is getting better weapons, but also we're losing some of the best of our soldiers. So it's really hard to think beyond the end of the war because we're in the middle of this war, but we have to. We have to, because the understanding, I think, behind what I'm trying to do here is to think beyond and try to understand what can be done by Ukrainians and others who are helping us in terms of securing more of a long-term, more of a strategic security for Ukraine. So basically making a lesson, drawing a lesson out of this war and how Russia was able to invade massively, how Ukraine fought back, but in many ways wasn't ready. And many other countries were not ready quite properly to address this issue and maybe prevent this from happening. So the idea is to, like, what can we do? Can something be done in the longer term to provide Ukraine with more viable, working, effective security that would maybe make it impossible for Russia to invade in such a massive, horrific style as they did this time around? Well, we still don't know. Will this war be a wake-up call for everyone in the West? Will be a new Cold War there or not? It could go both ways. It's a bifurcation event, obviously. It's a big moment when everyone choosing where to go from here. But it could be a new Cold War. It could be an systemic understanding of Russia being a threat, and therefore, some actions by our allies in the West and elsewhere to address the issue of Russia being a threat, and of course Ukraine being being a battleground, being in the front line of this war against new aggressive belligerent Russia. Or would it be maybe something different? Maybe after all, when the guns would silence, even for a short period of time, the forces in the West who would say, "Oh, okay, we're done with this war. That's fine. So let's just turn this page and let's go." To business as usual with Russia would prevail. I hope not. It doesn't look like they would be able to do it. It would be possible to actually go to business as usual with Russia after this horrific war. But still, there are voices here and there, as we know. So I mean, this one point here is just for us to understand that different tracks would be open for us going forward. One thing we need to understand, and I don't think in a group of Ukrainians here, in this group of ours, in this project, I don't think I should really convince you of that, is that the Russia would continue to be a threat to Ukraine going forward. I mean, basically forever. I mean, quite frankly, I do not anticipate any changes ever in Russia domestically in its ideology, practice of foreign policy. They're thinking about Ukraine, the relationship with the West, that would actually take away their aggression and the belligerence and the anti-Ukrainian feelings and so on, and this imperialistic drive and urge that they have towards Ukraine. I believe that we should continue thinking about the future of Ukraine's security under assumption that Russia will continue to be a threat. So first of all, they might continue with this war. Who knows? There might be a pause and then repetition and then a new stage. Or there might be a bigger pause or even some kind of a peace agreement. Who knows? That's possible. I mean, that's theoretically possible. And then there could be another aggression. So, I mean, the driving assumption here is that Russia will continue to be a threat, the threat to Ukraine, and not just some kind of a tactical threat, not even like something in the first 8 years of the war between 2014 and 2022, when it took Crimea, messed with Donbass, but an existential threat, the threat which can actually put in danger the very existence of the Ukrainian state, Ukrainian nation state, Ukrainian people, and so on, Ukrainian culture. So I think that's an assumption, and we can have a discussion if you like, but that's my feeling, and I think that probably most of you would agree. I recently wrote a piece about this for one magazine journal here, academic journal here in the West, and the editor wrote to me back that my notion of Russia continuing to be a threat seemed essentialist to him. So basically he wasn't quite convinced that this is the case. He thought, okay, maybe Russia will change, it cleans, it would democratize, it would do away with some of the worst features in it, and it would cease to be a threat to Ukraine. But I don't know. I don't think anyone could be in the same shoes with us Ukrainians, but we who've been in those shoes, we don't have to be essentialists. We don't really need to look for arguments to prove the case of Russia continuing to be a problem, threat, a very serious threat, dire threat to Ukraine. So what can we do then? I mean, what can we do? What is viable? What is realistic? What can be achieved? What not? Because of course there is so much in the public space, the information space, and debates and the media. There is so much diversity and misunderstanding often, and frankly naivete in terms of what could be achieved realistically, what couldn't be. Because people say, okay, we would like this to be happening, but can it be happening? Okay, I mean, is it realistic? Can it be happening like in the years from now? How soon? 1 year from now, 10 years from now? So there are so many assumptions. We know what we want, but what we can get with all the goodwill that we have in Ukraine from many countries supporting us through this last year is not a guarantee. It's not could not be taken for granted that they would continue to support us, first of all, and moreover, to move to another higher level of support, thinking about Ukrainian security strategically and long term, right? So, like I said, any thinking about this current war makes a problem, creates a barrier or obstacle or hurdle on our way of thinking about long term, because we don't know how this war will end. But for the benefit of the conversation and looking at the options that we might have going forward as Ukraine with our allies, I think let's assume that this war will be somehow over at a certain point of time. And we need to think then what happens next, because of course this massive assault, it can be repeated. It will be repeated, then we go through again the same cycle of heroism and resilience and people dying and missiles flying and our land being grabbed by occupiers. So definitely we try to avoid this. Okay, we try to avoid this. The fact that Ukraine has been able to fight back successfully, it doesn't necessarily mean that going forward we fight. So therefore, nothing can be taken for granted. Like we can remember even with this war, earlier, of course, shock, a bit of panic, for a lot of Ukrainians. Then, of course, some events that almost made us euphoric and, made us understand and believe that Ukraine is going to survive. And also certain times when some lands were liberated, that created, an assumption that, okay, we're kind of fighting back. We even liberating the land, but what's going to happen next, we don't know. And what's going to happen after this war, we don't know. So Russia is still strong. I think that in recent weeks, I thought a lot about that. In addition to the notion of resilience of Ukraine, we should probably, unfortunately, look at the notion of resilience of Russia, because there is such a resilience. It's very different from what we have in Ukraine, different roots, different, manifestations of the resilience, but they're resilient. They're now resilient with their economy fighting back sanctions and actually having this prospect of actually surviving the sanctions. They're now resilient in terms of trying to maybe manufacture more military production that they would need for the war. They clearly have enough money to fund the war, unfortunately. So the ideological atmosphere in Russia, I'm afraid they're successful in trying to turn this war into some kind of a defensive, fair, just, patriotic war against all the enemies who want to defeat Russia and maybe do away with Russia, maybe just destroy Russia. So, and I'm afraid they have some resilience, like I said, quite different from what we have in Ukraine, but it is there. So therefore, we shouldn't be naive in terms of them, like being too weak to leave us alone at some point of time. They would never. I mean, I think the very existence of independent Ukraine next door to Russia is really contrary to what they think about themselves. So it also goes to the issue of like strategic culture, identity, security identity, and so on. So one thing that we can do, obviously, is do nothing. Just remain. Keep the status quo. So basically, not address this issue in any meaningful way. Not to change our behavior or not to create a new model for the Ukraine security. But that we understand quite resolutely that that's not an option really, because it would mean that we continue to be weak and vulnerable and at the mercy of Russia, and they can attack again. If we don't draw right lessons working with our allies internationally, And we are sure, we can be sure, I think, of the fact that there will be a lot of allies and countries who will be willing to support Ukraine even beyond this war, even when the war is over. I think that we need to understand the status quo, of course, is not an option. So basically what we can have several options. One is a NATO membership. Another one is no membership, but continuing, deepening intensive cooperation with NATO. So basically becoming some kind of NATO plus ally, or maybe even de facto member, quotation marks, without actual membership. Another option is some kind of external security guarantees, and there's been a lot of talk about it last year, of course, you know, in Ukraine, like who can provide us security guarantees, what kind, and so on. And finally, there is also a necessary element which can be seen as an option, maybe in combination with other options that I've just mentioned. This is militarization of Ukraine or increasing of military preparedness of Ukraine. And I think that should be a necessary element anyway, but maybe coupled, accompanied by other things that we need to do. So one thing is, the one thing that we need to deal with first, NATO membership, and that's an interesting subject to talk about. I mean, on one hand, theoretically, of course, it's it's something which is still available for Ukraine. Formally, yeah, the open doors policy didn't disappear. Moreover, we remember how in the months coming up to February 24th of last year, there were discussions between Russia and NATO allies. When Russia was insisting on them basically doing away with their open doors policy. But they didn't. They actually been very resolute and strict and prudent and very consolidated in basically saying, no, we're not going to be allowing you, Russia, any veto power. We keep our open doors policies and so on. So I don't think that will actually change. So formally, of course, open doors policy is still there. Moreover, actually, in the recent months of this war, there have been maybe some positive shifts in terms of addressing this possibility. Is one of the options, theoretical conceptual options, is Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. One positive shift is that, of course, within Ukraine, domestically, you do have a major change in public opinion in support of this idea of NATO membership. It started happening obviously after 2014, after Crimea and Donbass, and we already had through years this positive figures on sociological public opinion polls showing that Ukrainians support this idea of becoming a NATO member. But of course, the scale of Russian aggression since February last year has made it even more so. So I mean, there's no debate even within Ukraine now that Ukraine should rather be part of this collective security agreement, so not just be left tete-a-tete, eye-to-eye, vis-a-vis, alone, vis-a-vis this very aggressive, belligerent Russia. So therefore, the public opinion change is massive, and it's not gonna change too much when the war is over, I think. Not a sociologist, but I think it would be a safe bet to say that even if the war somehow ends, that wouldn't necessarily mean, not at all, that Ukrainians would actually be cooling down on this idea of NATO membership. Right now, I think we have this vivid, very illustrious case of why Ukrainian experts in the field of security and foreign policy and defense been saying for years, if not decades, that we are in a very uncomfortable position here. We're in a gray zone, we're in the vacuum of security, we're a buffer Z state, we're a battleground state, and now we are a battleground state. Yes, and therefore we need to think about membership. But it wasn't convincing enough to many people in Ukraine. So public was kind of divided on this. And now it's much more convincing to just average people, common folks, who would say, yeah, of course, now see what happens when the Russia throws everything they have at us, and how we fight back heroically, but we suffer, struggle. So it's difficult, very hard struggle. So, oh yeah, okay, now we understand what they probably meant, those experts who were saying that Ukraine should be a member of NATO. Another thing is in the political spectrum, also in Ukraine, as we understand, as we know, there's basically no pro-Russian segment for the time being. And again, basically missing, it's basically absent. It's not there. First time in our history, I think there is nothing that we can actually say, okay, this is a pro-Russian segment within Ukrainian political spectrum. On a NATO membership, I think everyone would agree within Ukrainian political party that that's a good idea. So that's another thing. A couple more things. I mean, one thing that Zelensky was actually hinting in the days coming up to February 24th last year, that okay, if it's really if the whole skirmish and all these military preparations by Russia are about them not wanting Ukraine to go to NATO, then we can consider, maybe making some kind of a statement that we're not planning to go to NATO or anything like that. But now, because we've been attacked anyway, Zelensky is in a position to do away. He's not. He has no reason to make any similar statements anymore because, okay, we told you, Russia, we're not going to NATO, and you knew it, that there is a opposition to this idea of inviting Ukraine to NATO from a number of member states. And we also told you out loud, okay, let's talk about it. We can make the statement. We're not planning to go to NATO. That'll be complicated a little bit because of constitution amendments and so on, but could have been done. No, Russia decided to attack anyway, massively, cruelly. Okay, then all our suggestions that we can talk about it and actually maybe sign some kind of an agreement, maybe even, or at least do a public binding statement about us not pursuing membership within NATO, is not in the air anymore. It's not in the works because Ukrainians would not really consider this. So that's an interesting change, and actually a number of countries who are now saying before the war, but by war I mean, of course, it's massive war, well, probably not a good idea to invite NATO to join. That they now reconsider. So it's back on the table in many ways, even though, of course, you still have plenty of member states who would definitely be very uneasy, about this idea of Ukraine joining. A couple more things, with Ukraine. First of all, there was this discussion all the time, should Ukraine become a member of NATO or not? And people were saying, okay, but maybe Ukraine would be like a consumer of security, Euro-Atlantic security, and not enough of a provider to Euro-Atlantic security. Now, this debate has made a major turn in the sense that Ukraine has proven that we can actually provide a lot. We fight back, we have good military, we have resilience, so we're definitely not a failed state. We're something contrary to the notion of failed state. We're anti-Afghanistan, if you like. I hope in this group you would excuse me for maybe this not being too politically correct, but yeah. So the discussion that we had between August of 21, when the Americans withdrew from Afghanistan, and February 22, will Ukraine become another Afghanistan? It's over. It's been quickly over in the first days of the war. Of course not a failed state. So yeah, I mean, if you're NATO, you would love to have someone on your eastern flank so formidable, so heroic, and so experienced now in fighting the threat of Russia. So that's a change. Another change is, of course, that Ukrainian military has been really working a lot with NATO. So that the links of cooperation are unprecedented. I mean, it's day and night, 24/7. It is basically a war for them as well, except that they're not fighting it. Ukrainians fighting it on the ground, but of course, it's their war for many of them. And also the weapons. Look at the weapons the Ukrainians are now using. Basically, already runs through everything in kind of Soviet legacy weapons. They call it Soviet legacy weapons, so basically produced in Soviet times and so on. And we're now getting more and more of these Western weapons. And that was another thing, because people were saying, how can we invite Ukraine to NATO? They would spend so much time on learning to use those weapons that we use and adjust and adapt. We're doing it as we fight Russia. So for what many other recent newcomers to NATO spent years and years adjusting to those weapons, learning how to use them, getting them, producing them sometimes in their own countries, Ukraine is done within months. So that's another thing, so you shouldn't worry anymore about Ukrainians not being capable of mastering and learning how to use NATO weapons, because we already have them. We're using them, we're getting them as we speak. Every day there's more and more with coming in. So basically soon I think there'll be no red lines left in terms of what they can give us, except for, of course, nuclear weapons. But maybe one day I think maybe jets, airplanes would come as well. So anyhow, by the time this war has a pause or over or somehow ends, the Ukrainian military would be really in position of having massive arsenals of NATO newest military technologies and experience and knowledge how to operate it. So that takes away another barrier, which was often mentioned. Like, okay, so Ukraine, first of all, fights heroically. It could be a major, contributor to Euro-Atlantic security. It also has those weapons. It has great military, which is thinking really well, creatively a new, unlike Russian traditional military, which is suffering from their Soviet, post-Soviet way of thinking. The trainings that Americans and others had with Ukrainian military clearly been working out. I wouldn't exaggerate the significance of that, but we shouldn't downplay the significance of that. How Ukrainian military has been capable to deal in a tactical way, very creative, on the ground with Russian incoming troops. It's also in a big way. It's due to those trainings, which was focus was on command and control, tactical units, behavior, and so on and so on. So basically, what we're talking about is a bunch of factors that actually kind of put Ukraine back on the map. Excuse my choice of words, because map, I didn't mean the membership action plan, but yes. I don't think we'll be offered a membership action plan anytime soon. But the idea of Ukraine maybe going back to this idea of NATO membership is still there. I mean, not to take it away. The thing that I've mentioned already, that of course, whatever way this war ends, there will be a bunch of countries opposed to this idea. And well, it's a big idea. It has to go through the voting in parliaments and all member states and so on. So I guess. It's still a long time away from maybe Ukraine becoming a member of NATO. But then, of course, another option which is open still, which is cooperation with NATO, which is ongoing already. And in many ways, it was intensifying even prior to February 24th. And one of the reasons actually which maybe pushed Putin to this genocidal war is that he was seeing this increase of cooperation with NATO, and more trainings and more javelins coming. And then also in the Black Sea, for instance, Brits were working with us, basically building another, naval harbor, naval base in the Jacyk and so on. So he was seeing all those little things, and he was saying, okay, if we don't really do anything right now, then Ukraine's cooperation with NATO would only increase, would deepen, and it would be even more difficult for us. So the time to attack is now. If we attack like in 5 years, then Ukraine is much stronger. So and that was probably one of the reasons he attacked. Anyway, one of the reasons, because I believe it's a long list of reasons. I don't think I tend to be one of those who believe it's not one reason why he attacked. It's actually a combination of factors. But anyhow, so we can actually continue working with NATO in this NATO plus Ukraine, NATO plus de facto member quotation marks formula. When you're getting this assistance, when you're getting those weapons, when you're working with military is involved very much. So Americans, so much. I mean, in recent weeks and months, we've seen so many publications about everything, like how Americans were helping us even to plan offensives, say in Kharkiv and Kherson, and maybe trick Russians into not understanding where attack would happen first, and so on. And then also just a few days ago, there've been some articles about how Americans are actually providing very concrete, detailed, and precise whereabouts, coordinates of targets, Russian military targets for Ukrainian military, and then Ukrainian military would strike with American weapon, and others involved as well. So I mean, we are talking about absolutely unprecedented experience of cooperation. If you think that you have a bunch of countries which are members of the military alliance, and then you have country Ukraine, which is not a member of that military alliance, but the plethora, the network of cooperation is absolutely unprecedented. So here's about NATO and NATO plus. Now what about security guarantees? Of course, we are back to this idea in some ways, because we understand also that yes, we probably need some kind of a precise and viable and effective and prudent guarantees for us. But the problem is that it's early in this conversation. And the one thing we don't want to have is we don't want to have, in the end of the day, some kind of a Budapest Memorandum too. Because of course, the Budapest Memorandum was never a viable mechanism of providing Ukraine security, but yet somehow it was seen by many people, and I can't even mention how many times I hear people talking about Budapest Memorandum, and I wonder, like, have they ever read it actually? Because it's quite simple and very short document, and it's clearly articulated what should be done, for instance, if Ukraine is under attack. So, in other ways, in other sense, never been a clear mechanism, the protecting Ukraine's security. So, whatever we might get in terms of Ukraine's security guarantees in the future. There should be much more working. There should be actually guarantees, not assurances. They should be, immediately triggered maybe by another case of Russian aggression. So there are so many prerequisites that you would have to have in place for it to work. And we're not there yet. I mean, the discussion has just started. We can remember, like in the spring or early in the war, in the early spring last year, there was discussion in Turkey, in Istanbul, between the Russian-Ukrainian delegation, and you may remember how Ukrainian delegation actually said that we might have some compromise with Russia, but that would require security guarantees. And immediately that actually was, created a lot of uneasiness in Ukraine among the experts, like what kind of security guarantees? Are we actually signing up to neutrality? Who is giving us security guarantees? What do you call those security guarantees? And, because we quickly discovered that Russia is not really planning to negotiate, they want to continue invasion. A lot of people believe now that the discussion in Istanbul was actually a smoke screen. Russia pretending, playing diplomacy, basically pretending that they are ready for diplomacy, because they basically speak all the time about how, oh yeah, we're ready for negotiations, but on our own conditions, which is not acceptable to Ukraine. But the discussion about security guarantees was kicked in a full gear for a number of months, and as we know, there was this creation of the expert group, which called Rasmussen Yermak, so co-chaired by Anders Fogh Rasmussen, former Secretary General of NATO, and of course Andriy Yermak, who is the chief of President's office. They come up at some point in the fall with some statements and press releases and press conferences explaining what they have achieved. Well, they have achieved the start of conversation, because for right now we still don't know, much about how those security guarantees would work, how would they look, what kind of commitments there would be. For instance, like what countries would actually be involved, because earlier in the conversation last spring, we heard all sorts of things like, oh, maybe China would be a guarantor, maybe Turkey, maybe like Italy, and then immediately at this moment, anyone who is following the international, environment for this war for Ukraine, fighting back against Russia, immediately understood that that would be completely hollow, very formal, non-binding, only on the paper kind of guarantee. So that's exactly what we don't need, maybe even worse than what the president wanted. So we're basically talking about circling the countries, determining the circle of countries who might actually provide the guarantees. Actually, two countries that were most enthusiastic and provided tons of assistance to us were very reserved, very cautious in not saying anything publicly about them being ready to provide us with any kind of new type of security guarantees. That's United States and United Kingdom. They were notably missing in that discussion. So that tells us a lot, because those countries who would be actually involved actively in helping Ukraine if there is another aggression in the future, they understand what it would mean, and they're not ready, to subscribe, to commit, and to actually be part of this. So also, of course, since I mentioned the United Kingdom, there was this earlier talk about maybe some kind of a ad hoc tactical security grouping with Great Britain, Poland, maybe Baltic countries, and Ukraine. But that would be enough, clearly, even if we have some progress. Clearly, it was a brainchild of Boris Johnson, the former prime minister. But there is some continuity in their policies towards Ukraine, obviously, in London. But that would be enough, not enough, clearly, to provide Ukraine with security guarantees, that kind of a grouping. So we need something else. One thing is, of course, like we need to understand that how binding this agreement. So actually, what are you gonna expect from them to do? I mean, can you actually be sure that those guarantors would immediately, the moment Ukraine is attacked, actually do something quickly? In many ways, it reminds us of Article 5 or Chapter 5 in the founding treaty of NATO, Washington Treaty from April 1949, but even maybe more. Because in my discussions with experts in the field of security in the West, they treat this, what Ukraine needs is even deeper security guarantee commitment than Article 5 of Washington Treaty. Because in Article 5, what you have is one country is attacked. Yes, everyone should come to help that country to defend itself. But everyone is deciding what they're going to do, what they're going to send. They can take time maybe to decide what they're going to do. Should they send troops? Should they send some kind of material? Should they send some financial assistance for that country to be defending itself? So even Article 5 is not necessarily binding. Ukraine needs something bigger, much more triggering, like immediately, the moment Ukraine is attacked, immediately the support is coming. And of course, still, what would be missing, absent in this arrangement, would be no decision on any other countries sending their troops to Ukraine to fight Russia with Ukrainian troops. This didn't happen this time around. That remains a priority, absolute imperative for Western countries supporting Ukraine to avoid by any means a direct confrontation with Russia, except maybe still possible, unfortunately, scenario of maybe Russia using weapons of mass destruction and then NATO countries actually doing their retaliation, conventional weapons strike on Russian troops in Ukraine. So in the future, then nothing would probably change. I don't think the strategic planners of the public in the West would be okay with this idea that when Russia attacks Ukraine next time, Americans, Poles, and others will actually send quickly their troops to fight Russians in Ukraine. So that is missing. So therefore, we don't. I mean, what Ukraine is having in terms of expectations about security guarantees, I think there is a gap in what can actually be given. And that's why we now understand that this discussion about security guarantees is not going to be quickly resolved. We're not going to come to mutual understanding of what it could be. And also, in terms of invasion, assume Russia in the future, when this war is over, but in the future attacks Ukraine, but not that massively as they did last February. Would that be enough to trigger those security guarantees or not? Because even prior to February 24th, some of you might remember, there was one of those press conferences by Biden when he said the war is imminent, Russia is going to attack Ukraine. That's their understanding was for a long time before February 24th. But then he misspoke a little, as he sometimes happens with him. And he said, well, we'll see how we react. If it is a minor incursion, he said, I quote, will be one type of reaction. If it's a massive invasion, it'll be a different type of reaction. So he was quickly criticized, like, what do you mean minor incursion? Incursion is an incursion, invasion is an invasion. But of course, we understand what he meant. If there was some Russian aggression, say, to occupy modern Donbass, and there'll be no other directions in their attack on Ukraine, there'll be different, ball game, as they say here in the US, a different situation and maybe different scale, different type of support for Ukraine. Maybe more similar to what we received between 2014 and 2022 than what we have been receiving in terms of support since February 24th. So yeah, in terms of discussion about guarantees, that's another problem here. Like, okay, Russia might be smarter next time. They might do a bunch of minor incursions. And there will be some people, some leaders in some countries in NATO will be saying, oh, but this kind of aggression is not really an aggression, it's really a minor thing. It shouldn't really trigger some massive assistance and support to Ukraine. So there are a lot of things that we need to think through in terms of this security guarantees, and that's a big part of the conversation. For right now, we shouldn't say that we don't need them. Obviously, we need them, but for now, we need to be honest with ourselves and with our allies and have a transparent conversation. So nothing should be left unsaid, unspoken. Like, we need to understand clearly what they're planning to do, what they're willing to do, what they're not. Whether red lines are. Is it acceptable to us or not? Can we do something for them to shift their red lines, maybe for the future times of aggression or not? Because we need to have this conversation. It's not going to happen quickly. I don't think that while this war is raging, actually could be concluded, this kind of conversation. So we're not putting to rest this idea of security guarantees in Ukraine. We should be working in that direction, but we shouldn't be necessarily expecting quick success, total success in this discussion in terms of discovering and exploring this particular option. So the final, moment here, I think, is that we need to understand that we need to increase our military preparedness within Ukraine. There's no way around it. I mean, of course, it means militarization of Ukraine to some extent. And here is the difficulty in many ways. Well, first of all, turning the country, which was peaceful, democratic, into some kind of military camp, a militaristic camp. It's not exactly maybe an idea, a future scenario that we would all like for ourselves in our country, but there might be no other alternative. Like we've seen what we're dealing with right now. We need to militarize Ukraine more. We need to have more military preparedness, because clearly there was lack of it. There was some level of it, as we see now with Ukrainian military fighting back, but there was not enough. and therefore the nexus that would be, the focus would be on increasing that military preparedness, what needs to be done within Ukraine in terms of economic decisions, in terms of social policies. And I don't know whether it will be detrimental for the very character of Ukraine being an open democratic state. It might be. There might be at some point of time some contradiction here. One example I can give from this country of the United States, where I'm in right now, post 9/11, when US was attacked as a country, and how immediately in this country where you have this democracy really entrenched, democratic institutions quite strong, how much was done in terms of curtailing, people's rights, in terms of monitoring their behavior, the Petro attack and other things. And because the country was terrified of what happened on 9/11, most of Americans said, sure, fine, go ahead with this. And if that can happen in US, it could definitely happen in Ukraine. I mean, of course, a lot of people would say security first, freedoms and liberties second. That would be a problem, of course, because we cherish our democracy in Ukraine. That's what we often say. One of the things that you see in this war is a democratic country against authoritarian. And that's one of the reasons why if you believe in the same ideals, liberal democratic ideals, should help Ukraine. And that's one of the things that helps to mobilize support for Ukraine, because Ukraine is a democratic state. If we kind of backtrack a little bit on this because of this militarization and increasing military preparedness, that might be problematic. Like even with martial law, of course, we need it now. But assume for a moment, and hopefully soon at some point of time, the scale of fighting would be lower and not as intensive. Would we need martial law then? What if we return in Ukraine? It's an honest conversation that we should have with ourselves and our friends in the West. If we return to the scale of fighting similar to what we had for 8 years between 2014 and 2022, would we need to have martial law or not? Would our government actually be willing to do away with it if there is a major pause in the war, or maybe a major subsiding of the scale in fighting? So yeah, I mean, there are many discussions that could be had, and clearly we should have them. But what now emerges is probably way going forward for Ukraine is maybe a combination of several of those things that I've just mentioned in my conversation. I'm going to be closing down in a minute or two, because we need to have a discussion here, conversation with each other. So basically, it's a little bit of everything. One thing is clearly continuing working with NATO allies who are willing to support us, and I'm sure there will be a coalition of willing who would continue to work with Ukraine. So if not massive guarantees by alliance in general, then a number of member states who will be fine with continuing to help Ukraine as we go forward. Second of all, not dropping entirely this idea of NATO membership whatsoever, no, but understanding clearly that's not going to happen anytime soon. And actually doubling down on the idea of joining EU too, because, well, what happened to us because of the war, and thanks to the war, and thanks to heroism and resilience in Ukraine, that we got this candidate status. It's not binding, it's not something that really opens the doors to EU wide for Ukraine, but it's just a step in the right direction, so we should be doubling down on that as well. And finally, you should continue working in this framework of talking about what kind of guarantees we might receive, and increase the military preparedness of Ukraine using that assistance that we're going to be getting from our allies in the West. And Ukrainian military would be, of course, bigger anyway by the time this war is over. And so therefore, we need to think about the proper way to deal with mobilization, demobilization. Would you keep in the war when the war is over? Do you actually allow everyone to go back home to their families or not? That will be a bunch of painful decisions there to make. Maybe it's premature to talk about it because we're still in the middle of this big war, but still, there'll be a bunch of decisions to be made. But the military preparedness would be there in terms of weapons, in terms of people being there who are capable to use those weapons. Maybe quicker kind of type of mobilization in the case if there is another aggression, and so on. So as we can see, I mean, there are many things that are not defined clearly as we go forward, but there is clearly an understanding, there is a need to have this talk about what happens when this horrible, massive war is over, like what would happen next, because we could not, in a good mind, in a clear mind, being Ukrainians, allow ourselves to be not drawing lessons from this big, massive war. We need to understand what we do next, what we do, to better provide for more viable kind of working security for our country, because the threat would be still there. and we need to make sure that Ukraine is still there, and therefore we need to think big and need to think strategically. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thanks. That was fantastic talk. I think you raised, a number of important issues, so we'll have a little bit of time for discussion. I'm going to start off with, sort of a comment / question, which is, I mean, you've definitely convinced me that, I think no one here in this seminar disagrees that sort of that Ukraine, merits membership in NATO. But of course, as you mentioned, there are a lot of sort of, obstacles that are seemingly sort of hard to imagine ever overcoming, at least in the near term. In addition to ones you mentioned, the fact that sort of membership, and I thought Ukrainian membership in NATO was always hard to imagine after 2014 because of Russia had created these contested borders. And as you say, given the fact that sort of Russia is likely to be aggressive for a long time and sort of make claims on Russia's border, on Ukraine's borders for a long time, it seems hard to imagine Europe allowing, Ukraine into NATO in a situation which would lead to, immediate war with Russia. And it's also hard to imagine sort of countries like Hungary ever agreeing to NATO. And finally, it's hard to imagine, even if, we did join NATO, that Russia would be convinced that, of Europe's sort of willingness to actually intervene, as you said, with the problems of Article 5. So I'm wondering, as you hinted, that the sort of the most viable model, I mean, obviously, Ukraine should continue pushing for security guarantees, but assuming that those, kind of effective guarantees aren't coming in the near future, a more viable model would sort of be a kind of Israel or Vietnam model, which is, really security is rooted in their own domestic, military capacity, and everybody knows the Israel situation, which is, Israel is not part of any kind of necessarily formal NATO type of alliance. But in Vietnam, in the 70s faced threat of invasion from China. And the way it dealt with that, threat of invasion is it built one of the most powerful, militaries in the developing world. And that's ultimately, I think, is going to be the only thing that really prevents, discourages Russia from invading is Ukraine's own domestic military capacity. Right. And so I'm wondering whether we should really be focusing on that, and as you said, sort of dealing with sort of the potential, complications in terms of obviously maintaining a democracy. But I'm just wondering what you think about that.
Right. So great question, look, on basically a bunch of questions here. One thing is that I need to say that, yes, dramatically has been no change in Ukraine's chances to becoming a member of NATO. Because of this war since February last year. But I still wanted to focus on several features that have changed a little bit the situation in terms of Ukraine maybe having a better chance now. But yes, of course, there will be a lot of obstacles in that way. But in terms of frozen conflicts, actually, that's interesting discussion, because NATO has clarified situation on Georgia some years ago, for instance, when they said basically we can invite Georgia as a member state if the moment comes, even without them controlling South Ossetia and Abkhazia. So they basically did away with some of their earlier traditional historical clause on if you have territorial disputes, then you cannot be considered for membership in NATO. Now, there might be a case for Ukraine. Hopefully, of course, we all hope that Ukraine will be able to liberate all its land occupied by Russia currently, but if that is not going to happen, then we might have some regions outside of Ukraine. There could be some kind of frozen conflict situation, and NATO might say, okay, we can actually invite the bulk of Ukraine, the most of Ukraine in, and then it might not trigger immediate conflict with Russia by us and NATO members. There could be a clause signed. There could be some tacit agreement between Ukraine and NATO that Ukraine is invited, most of it. Those regions that are beyond Ukraine right now, beyond control of Ukrainian government, okay, there will be no immediate conflict. But it's a tricky road, obviously, to travel, but something can be done. In terms of Israel or Vietnam option, In Israel, yes, could be so. Well, even though they have a bunch of enemies, we have only one, but very strong one. And also in Israel, they receive massive assistance traditionally from the United States. So we need assistance too. In Vietnam case, I don't know. I don't think that China, for instance, has ever wanted to, basically destroy Vietnamese state or occupy entire Vietnam. So therefore, the scale of the threat is different. And Vietnam is not receiving much assistance from anywhere else. So they are on their own. So yes, that's actually their own like military preparedness.
I mean, certainly in the 1970s, China, very much talked a lot about invade, and it actually did invade Vietnam.
Yeah, there was a war. There was a war.
But sorry, and it also received substantial Soviet support. So it's obviously a very different context. But some of the principles will remain. Which, I mean, I agree with you that sort of any kind of building Ukraine's military, as both with Israel and with Vietnam, is going to involve extensive outside assistance. But that's easier to obtain than any kind of security guarantee.
Sure.
Anyways, let's go ahead. Sure. Anybody else?
I'm done with your question. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Anybody else want to jump in?
May I, Lucan?
Please.
Well, actually, it's funny to listen to the conversation Lucan started, because actually I'm going to present in a couple of weeks on a comparison of a number of wars, and one of them is precisely the Sino-Vietnamese conflict in 1979. So I think we'll have a chance to continue the discussion about past parallels and not. But actually, the question I'm now having to Volodymyr, and by the way, thank you for a brilliant presentation, is the following. So how about building a kind of a regional alliance? Because that part of idea is being played with, like, the Baltic Black Sea alliance. Is it a viable solution to Ukrainian national security problem, on your opinion?
Right. Well, like I said when I talked about the UK idea earlier in the war, that there could be some kind of new security ad hoc coalition of countries with UK, Poland, Baltics, and Ukraine. I don't think that would be enough to secure Ukraine. Other players need to be involved with their military capabilities, with their economic prowess and power. So it would probably not be enough. But yes, we can work, and we are working already with a whole bunch of regional powers who are very troubled and worried about what Russia is doing and what Russia's next step could be, especially if it's successful in Ukraine. Like, are we next? So obviously, we need to work with them actively and explore all choices, except that not maybe at the expense of undermining NATO. Because if you invite into a certain alliance a bunch of countries which are member states of NATO, and then they do something with Ukraine which maybe contradicts somehow the general NATO's position, that would be a good solution for anyone, not for Ukraine, not for NATO, not for those countries. So yeah, we should work with them, and there you have the most resilient in that region. You have the most resilient supporters of Ukraine. And in terms of Black Sea, I'm much less optimistic, or should I say pessimistic, because I don't see that happening. Ideally, in the future, yes, Ukraine might emerge as a leader in the region. Actually, we've been asking this question for decades, maybe at various conferences, like, can Ukraine be a leader, regional leader in the Black Sea, wider Black Sea region? And most of the time we said, oh, probably not. But now actually we can, even though we're weakened by aggression and economies in ruins and everything, but we can, because we proved we can fight back and we can be strongly motivated, and we can be a regional leader. But who would the allies there be for us? I mean, there are a lot of countries sitting on the fence. There's Turkey, which is balancing. There's the Georgian government. Look at what Georgian government is doing in the recent months throughout this war. There's a major disconnect, obviously, with Georgian public opinion and what the government is doing, but they have a government, so that's what we have. And others in the region, like Romania, supporting of Ukraine, but would they be willing to go as far as to create some kind of a regional security alliance with Ukraine, and maybe even like giving leadership to Ukraine? I'm not sure. Bulgaria is a very difficult, specific case, and so I'm not sure they have the pieces really in place for this Black Sea kind of a regional security alliance being formed as a solution. But yes, we might explore it. Maybe Guam could be re-emerging. Moldova is really terrified, of course, of what they're seeing with Russian aggression. and even probably, as we hear, some plans to destabilize situation politically in Chisinau by Russia. So they would probably join. Azerbaijan might, others too. We'll see. Georgia, well, things might change. And so Guam might actually come back from this dormant stage back into existence, or some other formats of the Black Sea Regional Security Cooperation. But I'm not necessarily optimistic, and I'm not necessarily believing that we can have something quickly and viable enough, and for us to be saying, okay, we have something in the Baltic region, and then we have something in the Black Sea region, so we feel fine, and others can actually rest. And with those regional countries, or regional players, who would, together with Ukraine, they would have enough of the power collectively to withstand the future Russian aggression.
Okay.
Well, thank you, Volodymyr. Actually, I must be sincere. I have some reservations regarding the black part of that equation as well. I mean, many people in Ukraine have started thinking about it, but I don't think it's going to work alone. Just as you put it. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Ivan. Matt, Professor Light.
Hi, Matt.
Hi, Volodymyr. It's great to have you with us. I've been following your North American tour with interest on Facebook, and it's a pleasure to hear from you. Thank you very much for that presentation. I wanted to ask you about something you touched on earlier in your remarks about Russia's continuing ability to prosecute the war against Ukraine. I was thinking as you were speaking that it's actually very difficult for me, at least, to get a sense of what baseline expectations about that ability should have been before the war, and to what extent they have been revised since then. So I wonder if you could speak to that point a bit. I mean, are you at all surprised by the extent to which any aspect of Russia's warfighting abilities have held up? So whether that's its strictly military abilities, its economy, the regime's internal control, if you could just share with us your thoughts about that issue.
Right. Well, thank you, madam. Obviously, it's a great question, and it's some people used to say $1 million question, but it's actually multi-billion-dollar question, and not to mention lives involved. So we all want to understand where it's going. I mean, how much of this resilience Russia has in terms of sanctions, for instance. If you add up some more sanctions, would their economy maybe crumbling along the way or not? Have they found some kind of a magic wand, that they can use, or some kind of a bulletproof Teflon protection from those sanctions? Will others be providing them enough assistance, at least by buying their oil and gas, and they will continue buying many countries of their oil and gas, and therefore they can fund their war indefinitely. So the one problem is there. And the sanctions, of course, they are very porous often. There are loopholes, there are ways around them. We're now learning about how Russia is still getting a lot of stuff around the sanctions through intermediaries and so on. So that's problematic. I mean, another thing that they have the human reserve there. Clearly, we don't have some kind of revolution or rebellion within Russia because, okay, we're losing guys in Ukraine and have so many of them coming back in coffin. So, or at least it's ameliorated by this notion and narrative that this is our existential struggle. I mean, yeah, we're going to lose some guys, but we're against a very powerful enemy. And they want to destroy Russia, make all us like slaves and everything. So therefore we have to fight, and yeah, we should accept those losses and so on. And yeah, and I think militarily, the major question would probably be in terms of would they have the weapons? It looks like they would have a human potential there, reserves, and maybe mobilize more, which is a problem. I remember when they did mobilization, a lot of experts were actually dismissing, like almost like half jokingly, like, oh, wow, they're not well trained, not very well motivated, they're not well equipped. Well, you know what, if you add to the situation, which is already very difficult for Ukraine, 300,000 or maybe 200,000 people, even if who are not well equipped and well trained and not very well motivated. I mean, that's a big problem for Ukraine. And we're seeing it now in Donbass and Bakhmut and other places. So yeah, if they're capable of adding more, the same number maybe in the coming months, they say they're not going to mobilization, but they might. So it is a problem. I mean, therefore, but yes, if they run completely out of weapons, that would be a great solution for the whole situation, but so far they have tons of weapons. It looks like, again, people were laughing, no, under sanctions, they cannot really produce any more weapons, but it looks like they can. You know, they're still getting a lot of those chips and semiconductors and other things, and they produce some of those weapons. Okay, they are out of half of their tanks. Well, after 1 year of very intensive fighting, maybe they don't need that many of those tanks. So unfortunately, they're back in the business, but what the expectations they had early in the war, we don't quite know. I mean, we understand that they wanted to subjugate Ukraine entirely, really make it a quasi-state in some ways. They quickly understood that it's not going to work, but now they're doubling down, resilient, and Putin again having hopes of maybe through this war of attrition and through the strategic patience that he has, and he believes that Ukraine doesn't have, and the West clearly doesn't have, he believes, that he might still win. You know, and again, he probably understands that wouldn't be going back to the plan A, where you actually do away with Zelensky and you put new government in place and subjugate Ukraine entirely and make it firmly within the Russian sphere of control. So occupied or semi-occupied, that's probably not going to happen. He probably understands that, but he's still full of these ideas about how he can try and turn this war around. And I'm afraid there's a lot of fight going forward, and their red lights are shifting. I mean, the expectations and red lines are shifting for everyone in this war. It's very tactical in many ways. You know, what the West is going to do with those weapons. Should they give us more weapons? What kind of weapons? How quickly? For Ukraine as well, of course, we have this really high bar of expectations by public. We've been emboldened, and that's a good thing. Obviously, with Kharkiv offensive and Kherson liberation, the public has been emboldened that Ukrainian military can actually liberate lands. But what if we cannot see similar successes in the coming months, continue to have this major losses in Ukrainian military? What's going to happen next? It's definitely a trap for Zelensky, who also says there's no other option. We're going to liberate all our lands. But what if the moment comes when he actually has to sit down and maybe approve some compromise and maybe talk to Russia, and maybe de facto some lands would not be liberated? I mean, it's a very tricky moment for the country of Ukraine, for political leadership. His high rockstar ratings might actually go down really quickly because Ukrainians expect nothing else but liberation of all our land. So I mean, there's a lot of lines in the sand. You know, we should continue fighting. We should keep this grand strategic goal of liberating all Ukrainians from Russian occupation. But Russia is also very tactical. You know, I think they will reassess in a month or two from now. You know, can they actually grab the entire Donbass? And then at that point of time, then Putin might actually say, okay, from a day one, actually, you probably didn't pay attention, but we wanted to liberate Donbass. That's it. We wanted to protect the people of Donbass against Ukrainian Nazis. So we now have Donbass under our control. So okay, we're kind of ending our war in any other direction. So that's one of the options. There could be others. You know, everyone is waiting for his February 21st address. There might be no major changes there, or no major announcements actually for him to make. We'll see. You know, but everyone is shifting plans, strategic ideals, objectives, capabilities, and so on. Yeah.
Great. Thanks. Petro.
Hi, Volodymyr.
Hello, Petro. Good to see you.
Yeah, nice to see you now remotely. The last time we saw each other was in Lviv in a cozy cafe sometime in summer last year. I have a short remark and a question for you.
Okay.
You started from stating about the perpetual threat of Russia for Ukraine, and I immediately caught myself thinking how Ukraine has changed, because knowing you for many years and all the bunch of people from Odessa University, I wasn't surprised at all, but I'm sure that someone who doesn't really understand the contemporary context here in Ukraine, this would be a surprise. You're coming from, you're originally from Odessa. That's how really, again, Ukraine has changed. Normally people would, be willing to hear something like that from guys like me from Western Ukraine.
Yeah.
Anyway,
we're all hawks now, I guess. You know.
Yeah, true. And my question is about the security guarantees. You've talked quite a lot about this, and you perfectly know that one of the worries of Ukrainians for already quite some time is that the West might deal with Russia somehow secretly without, you know, Ukraine, and breaching this formula of nothing about Ukraine without Ukraine.
Mm-hmm.
You could also imagine something like that happening between the US and, say, China. That could be another scenario. But my question is there any way for us, for Ukraine, to avoid such a negative scenario? I mean, how is it really possible? We should still be always, you know, worried about this.
Yeah, it's another great question. Thank you, Petro. And I think I don't consider such an eventuality or probability as very feasible. It's very realistic for a number of reasons. Well, first of all, Ukraine has tons of agency in our hands right now. So ultimately, our fate in many ways in our own hands. So we can continue fighting, even if someone tells us, like, even among friends, like, you should stop fighting. We should still say, no, go to hell. I mean, we're gonna keep fighting and trying to liberate our land. So that's a big change there. And our allies are aware of the case of Ukraine having this agency. As we say, subjectivность, you know, so Ukraine is not only just an object anymore, and there is a great power politics around Ukraine, but Ukraine is actually doing a lot of decisions of their own. Second thing is, like, if we cannot really stop fighting, and they want us to stop fighting, maybe to reach some agreement with Russia, what leverage could they have actually to push Ukraine towards negotiations? You know, the ultimate leverage is only one. If they would make a decision, okay, we're not sending any money or any weapons anymore to Ukraine, to make Ukrainians stop fighting, stop the war. I don't think that's going to happen. I mean, for a number of reasons. I mean, first of all, they're really deeply involved in this war. There is a clear, genuine outrage about Russian aggression and war crimes and genocide and everything. There is clearly public in attention. Okay, yes, people are moving on. This is a long war, so people are probably moving and thinking about other things as well. You know, they tend to sometimes forget about the war. But if a decision is made such big as, like, okay, we're not supporting Ukraine anymore because Ukrainians' goals of liberating all lands are unrealistic, and we cannot be, involved in that or committed to that. I think the public would actually rebel. The big portion of the Western public would be rebelling and saying, like, what are you talking about? Here is clearly a victim of this vicious aggression. You know, there's a clear violation of human rights law, of international law. You know, if we are doing this, what about this international order? Are we actually putting it, into the grave forever? So I don't think it's going to happen. So therefore, they are more or less, if you put it open, just very blatant, in a blunt manner, blatantly, in a way, they're hostages to the situation and support of Ukraine. They could not really change their course so much. So yeah, if ultimately something would happen that would actually minimize or diminish a little bit the objectives for Ukraine militarily in this war, that would be only the perhaps inability to continue to fight it because of the losses on our side, and understanding that, well, the military that what we have is what we have. You know, it's not they're heroes, but they're not immortals, they're not invincible. So therefore, there is a limit to what they can actually achieve. I think that will be a bigger factor ultimately. So if you have Zelensky dealing with two of those factors together, some slight gentle pressure to some kind of negotiations from our Western allies, and on the other hand, understanding that, well, we're losing so many of our own guys, and no new Kharkiv happening, no new Kherson happening, like, what's the way forward for us? should we continue to lose the guys? But the human resources are uneven with Russia. It's asymmetric conflict anyway, even with weakened Russia. What are we going to do? So I think if those two factors would be in play, then it might actually push Ukraine, perhaps to some premature peace deal. But hopefully that would still be, we can still avoid this. Thank you.
Thanks. Victor?
Yes. Hi. Thank you very much. I agree with most of what you say. I would just, I've made two comments in the chat. Most of the military experts, not just Tom Cooper, but most of the ones I've been listening to, really do not take this mobilization. It's more like a full court press, psychological press, and there'll be movement, but no breakthrough looks possible. It seems that as Tom Cooper shown up, they basically replaced what they've lost with much less trained and much less better armed and troops. So, and the thing is really important is this troops thing, as important as this mobilization is a psychological factor, as the ISW reports brilliantly pointed out today in various ways along the war. They're now using this to show that Ukraine can't win. So, seed panic and despair, not only in Ukraine, but in the West. And they're really very good at this. So we have to be careful about that. That is a weapon.
Yeah, thank you, Victor, and thank you for sending those pieces. I saw them already, obviously, but thank you for sending them to me in the chat. Yes, I think that part of what they're doing was mobilization. Are you finished questioning?
No, I'd say the comments are for everybody.
Yeah. Okay. Right. Yeah. So I mean, of course, I understand that the psychological effect is a big part of what they do with mobilization, basically showing to Ukraine and the West like we can mobilize more people. So you can't win the war, you can't defeat Russia, right? Of course. But at the same time, when the ISW or others, Tom Cooper and others, are saying that, what they actually mean that maybe there'll be another Russian offensive towards Kyiv, like maybe them not having chances for big offensive. Because everyone is talking about Russia on the eve or maybe already in the starting days of the major offensive. But what do you mean by that? Like, should they be able to actually take much more land in Ukraine, or should be able to take, I don't know, ultimately Kramatorsk, God forbid? What do you mean by big offensive, right? Because we would see, but at the same time, we cannot neglect the massive reinforcement that they got there.
Of course.
If you listen to Ukrainian military there, just wave after wave coming. We kill a lot, but then it's another wave. Kill a lot, then it's another wave. And then we are out of munition. And then a lot of military says, well, we don't have shells anymore. And, in the West, they say, oh my God, we already found everything Ukraine might use from the Soviet systems. And we are sending them tons of, like NATO artillery systems, but they're running so quickly through it, fighting Russia. So how can you stop them if you're out of munition? Imagine it's people who completely have no arms and coming to Ukrainian positions. But if Ukrainian military don't have any ammunition to fight them back. So it is a problem. It is a problem. So therefore we're defending and losing tons of guys, near Bakhmut and other places. We are really distracted from any plan that we had that plan for counteroffensive and liberating some lands. So it is a problem. I mean, if you imagine, of course, if they send them with stones and sticks, but what if the other side, us, Ukraine, also don't have enough weapons? So that becomes a problem. And that's where you see how much Russian population is bigger, and how much they can actually mobilize more, because they can mobilize more. Yeah. So unfortunately, I say, of course, there is no sign of big trouble like Ukrainian state, Ukraine's existence is a threat. All right. But there's also no sign of Russia being done with it or not being capable to apply more pressure on our positions.
Yeah, I should add that
the West having throttled the weapons, and then no one expected that the Russians would, and the nationalities also would be not rebelling yet, and so forth.
Right.
So it's
Thank you,
a problem. Many unexpected things in this war. Thank you.
Of course.
Yeah, I should add that Yuri Zhukov, who's a wonderful expert on military in Michigan, you probably know him,
right,
made the comment a few months ago that Russia, and to support your point, that Russia is very much used to fighting a low-tech war with a lot of soldiers who really do not want to fight. That's sort of part of its MO. So
right.
In that sense, simply having a bunch of 18-year-olds, untrained 18-year-olds on the border with guns is could have a important impact on the war. Okay, Artyom.
Hi. Thanks, Volodymyr, for this tour.
I think we have to wrap it up, but go ahead.
Hi. Thanks, Volodymyr, for this tour into the future of Ukraine security. As you said, Russia will be considered for a long time as a security threat to Ukraine. In this regard, I have a question regarding, well, we talk a lot about alliances, about Ukraine future relations with West, with NATO, etc. But do you think Ukraine also need to have some kind of strategy regarding future of Russia? So kind of to be in the part of discussion in terms of what kind of Russia Ukraine sees after, for instance, victory on the battlefield or beyond military terms. Thank you.
Right, thank you, Artem. It's a great question, obviously. I mean, we probably don't think about it too much these days. Everyone's so angry and for a good reason. I mean, we just want them to suffer and leave us alone and maybe crumble. By the way, I don't think crumbling of Russia would be in our interest. I mean, the disintegration of Russian state, that's not something, that would create a favorable environment, I think, external environment for Ukraine. Because there will be so much instability for us. But the defeat of them, in the sense that they're not capable to actually bite anymore, is more meaningful. And actually, I think that the Secretary of Defense of the United States, Lloyd Austin, last spring, he said that, and his remark was walked back by White House, but he was right. He said, our objective is weakening of Russia to the extent that they cease to be a threat to Ukraine and other countries in the region. That's exactly what he can realistically achieve. So you're not talking about defeating Russia, like destroying Russian state or something like that. We're not talking about, we would like to see this happening, but we're not talking probably about like Ukrainian American troops marching in a victory parade in Red Square. We don't necessarily need it. We just need to get back to our borders and then protect our state. So, but what's going to happen with Russia? Yeah, well, I think we should keep in mind several scenarios, but one is less realistic, is that Russia would change quickly enough and drastically enough for it to be cease to be a threat to Ukraine. I think we have enough of reasons to understand that even if Putin is out of the picture, there will be certain continuation of their policies, and their approach to Ukraine, their attitude to Ukraine has been shaping for years and years. This denigrating Ukrainian lives, this whole thing about denazification and everything, that's not just something that happened just in the last year, obviously. So there'll be a problem. I actually believe that if Putin is out of the picture, that'd be a great thing for Ukraine, and I think the war will crumble. That's his thing, that's his initiative. So I don't think that we can actually find, if Putin is somehow out of the picture, that you'll be a new guy in his place who would continue the war. I actually think there'll be so much instability in fighting and quarrel within Russian political elite if Putin is out of Kremlin. That would clearly undermine their ability to successfully prosecute that war against Ukraine. But I don't know when that would happen. And we should therefore, I assume, it's my belief, my deep belief, work under assumption that Russia would continue to be a threat, and with whichever new guy in place instead of Putin and so on. So are we prepared for changes in Russia? Probably not, but we have other things on our plate. And I don't think there's clearly a chance for those changes in Russia happening anytime soon. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. It was great. I think you're absolutely right, Volodymyr, that even if, as a response to sort of the charge of essentialism, it's always better from Ukraine's point of view to assume the worst, in the sense of, it's always better to be prepared for the worst. Anyways, come on. Okay, so we're going to end it there.
Yeah.
And thank you so much. It was a great discussion. Next, we have on March 7th, Artem will be presenting on foreign fighters, which is, a very, interesting topic.
Thank you, Luca, and thank you, everyone. Thank you, guys. Have a nice.
See you on March 7th.